All right. Well, thank you very much. We're still working on that crystal skull piece, so we haven't closed that one down yet. I want to thank Jay and all of his staff for having me here tonight, and all of you for coming out, braving what this morning was looking like some pretty tricky weather, but turned out to be pretty good in the end here today. So much of what I do in my professional life is paleontology, the study of ancient life, and that takes me to lots of different places that Jay had mentioned around the world. I've spent lots of years working in Africa and Asia, and believe it or not, I've actually worked in the United States one time. So what we do for most of that is to go through areas that you see here, these sorts of badland areas, looking for fossils. Some of this is just surface excavating here, surface prospecting, where we're looking around. Other times we actually excavate. This is a Middle Stone Age site in Ethiopia. And we love all of our fossils, all of our sewn tools. So here is a rhinoceros, elbow joint from the humerus. You'll be hearing more about the humerus bone tonight. Sometimes our fossils are so big we literally run into them. This is a fossil tree, the base of a tree from Ethiopia that dates to 27 million years in age. And sometimes they're so tiny that you just can't even believe that they've survived fossilization and that we were lucky enough to pick them up. This is a bit of a frog pelvis, and if you're a 6-year-old and put that on the fingernail of your little pinky, it would only cover about half of that. This is a tiny, tiny little bone. So as I mentioned, that we love all of our fossils equally, but every once in a while, something spectacular is discovered, and that's certainly the case for Lucy. She was found in 1974, so we've had her with us for about a little over 42 years. The AL is for Afar locality 288. That's the 288th locality that they had found within the Afar. And what's remarkable about this fossil is her relatively complete aspect here. Now, like the fossil tree I showed you or the frog, usually we get just one bit of bone from any particular fossil, but Lucy, as you can see, preserves much of her skeleton. So much, in fact, that it's easy to go through and duplicate the pieces that are missing using the other side. So, for example, here's her left thigh bone. We can easily model that, mirror it, and make a right. She doesn't have a lower leg shin bone here, the tibia, but she does on the right, so we can mirror that. And we just go through piece by piece by piece, filling her out so that we have a very good idea about what she looked like. There are others who do work on this too. John Gurche, who's at the Denver Museum, is a very skilled anatomist. So he actually does lots of dissections on primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, humans. And when he does his flesh in reconstruction, he actually builds the exact size of the muscles, lays those on in plasticine, continues through adding on the skin, the hair, to the point where Lucy literally comes to life for us. This is something that's difficult to do with a single bone, but it's something that we really gravitate toward with Lucy. Now, when we study human evolution, there are lots of reasons to do this, lots of different ways to do it, but the main point is that we want to know what it is that shaped us, shaped our history, shaped our ancestors through, we think, around 7 million years or so. We abbreviate that as MA. So when you look at some of the features, for example, big brains, this is a human versus a chimpanzee. Our brain, for a primate of our size, is almost 3.5 times bigger than you would expect. But when we look at big brains, when did they first come into the record? About 2 million years ago or so. Tool use is something that humans do a lot of, with this man using an adze to dig out a canoe here. We're a tool-dependent species. This dates to the beginnings of things that we can recognize as tools to about 2.5 million years ago. There's some evidence that's still being evaluated that may push this back older. And when we look at chimpanzees today, we see that they make and use a whole variety of tools, but most of the things that they make and use are not the kinds of things that if we found them in the fossil record that we would identify them as a tool because they don't modify them, or they're built on plant material that decays too readily. So this is what we may see for tool use in some of the very earliest human ancestors. When we look at these two big brains and tools, these are not things that we see for Lucy. What is it we do see? We see bipedalism. That is our trait that we have still today, walking on 2 legs instead of 4 legs. So bipedalism on 2, quadrupedalism on 4. This is certainly and it's agreed upon in Lucy at more than 3 million years of age, and again, for some evidence, it may go back as long as 7 million years ago. So when we think about these three traits, big brains, tool use, bipedalism, our bipedal mode of locomotion is one of the oldest traits that we have that we can track into the fossil record. And this is one of the things that we can learn about Lucy. So what is it about this fossil? That, as I mentioned, we've known this fossil. It's been out of the ground for more than 40 years. It's been studied intensively. It received big press when it came out of the ground, and it's been studied ever since. Well, tonight what I want to give you is a lesson really in how science works. That what we do today builds upon what other scientists have done in the past, and that's certainly the case for Lucy. That what we can do today is bring new approaches, new questions to this study, and sometimes new technologies as well. This, for you in the audience who are young people, is what you're going to be doing if you enter into science. That what you'll be doing is working on the things that we're doing today when you're an adult or even now, and making these sorts of new discoveries. The other nice thing about science is that it honestly is egalitarian. Anybody can do this. If a kid from Idaho who grew up on a farm, milking cows, slopping hogs, and collecting chicken eggs can do this, any of you can do this as well. One of the other reasons to do it, here's President Obama looking at Lucy. She's in 3 boxes here in the National Museum in Addis Ababa. Another reason to do it is it gets you close to President Obama. When he was shown this fossil, surrounded by the Ethiopian officials, their ministry officials, he just reached in and picked up a bone, and they all went, oh! They couldn't believe it. He touched a bone. So if you study Lucy and you pick up that bone, you are 1 bone removed from President Obama. So let's do some science. What do we know about Lucy? Well, she's a young adult female. How do we know that? When we look at her bones, bones grow in different areas for ossification. Her bones, where we have those points of ossification, are fully fused. So she's skeletally a mature individual. When we look at her teeth, all of her teeth are erupted, including her M3, her wisdom tooth. It's in occlusion, which means it started to wear, so dentally she's mature. We know that she's a female because of her small size. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And the specific anatomy of her pelvic region. So all of these points tell us that she's a young adult female. She would have stood about 1.1 meters, so she wouldn't have even come up to my waist or so, and weighed about 27 kilos, 60 pounds, so a tiny, tiny adult person. I think this is one of the reasons why kids identify with her. When they see a mounted skeleton of Lucy in the museums, they can look right in her eye. It's the only adult that they can see eye on. She was found in the Hadar in the Ethiopian area in northwestern Ethiopia here in the Afar Depression. Her species, Australopithecus afarensis, is known from Kenya and Tanzania. Lucy herself dates to 3.18 million years ago, but her species ranges from 3.9 to 2.9 million years ago. After 2.9 million years ago, there's no more afarensis. Other species start to show up in the record. Afarensis is the best represented fossil human species that we have. This is an early representation of that collection. Today, there are more than 400 specimens. Now, most of them are single bones, single fragments of bone, or a couple of teeth. That there aren't skeletons like Lucy within that. The paleobiology is interesting, and there are enough of some of these skulls known and the other parts of the postcranial skeleton below the neck to tell us that the males were much larger than the females. They have a body size difference where the males approach 2 times the size of the female. That's much more like gorillas than humans or chimpanzees. Lots of work has been done on the geology of the area, the paleontology, also the paleobotany that tells us that she lived in a wooded savanna. So there were grasslands and trees available to her. And as I've mentioned, it's clearly the case that she walked on 2 legs. One of the interesting points, though, about Lucy is that it is still, today, debated whether or not she climbed trees. If you look at our nearest relatives, chimpanzees, they are very adept tree climbers. So this question, you'd think it was one that we'd be able to solve. Were afarensis, the males and females, tree climbers or not? And I mentioned that clearly they were bipedal when they were on the ground. So how do we look at these sorts of data? Well, in doing this, we look at the anatomy. And sometimes it's fragmentary, but we always look at it within a comparative context. So here's a comparison of the thigh bone or the femur of a human and a gorilla. And one of the things that's characteristic about us with bipeds, that as we walk, we're balancing our center of gravity over 1 foot of support. That means, to do that, that our knees have to be close together, our hips are apart, so that when we lift up that leg to move, we don't have to move our torso very far. If I was a chimpanzee walking, chimpanzees' knees don't come together. When they walk bipedally, they have to move their body way over that leg of support. They take a step way over because the anatomy of the lower extremity is different. And even on this fragmentary specimen of afarensis, it shows that same sort of an angle here that makes it similar to humans. So this bone, just in and of itself, tells us that it was from a biped. Here's Lucy, which is much more complete, and I've reversed this. It's actually a left. I put it in here as a right so that it could do the comparison with the human and the gorilla. Well, what are some of these characteristics then? So in looking at the comparative anatomy, how does Lucy compare with humans? From the waist down, we see great similarities. The pelvic structure is similar, the femur, the hip joint, the knee joint, and coming down into the ankle. These are all adaptations for bipedalism. Here's, though, where this debate comes in. When we look at some of these other characteristics, Lucy shares characteristics with chimpanzees. For example, she has curved fingers, curved toes. Why is that in a chimpanzee? It allows chimps to hang on to curved branches. She has a shoulder blade that has a more anterior overhead orientation to it. Humans have a side orientation. Her hind limbs, lower limbs, are shorter relative to her upper limbs. The upper limbs are longer, just like a chimpanzee. So we have this mosaic of characteristics that, on the one hand, absolutely, there is no one I know in the field who disagrees that Lucy was bipedal when she was on the ground. The debate is about these climbing abilities. So if you think about this, the argument has really come down into two camps. One, this moving around on 2 legs. The scientists can't disagree with the fact that there are curved fingers and curved toes. You can measure that stuff. But what the group that believes that she was only bipedal, only terrestrial, argues is that, oh, those curved fingers, those curved toes, those are just inherited from an ancestor who was a climbing form. They don't have any functional significance in Lucy. They're just inherited. So does anyone here have a last name of Smith? I can't believe it if we don't. Or Miller? There's some out through here. Those names and their roots, their ancient roots, have to do with the profession. A smith was a blacksmith. A miller was a miller running a mill. It's very unlikely that today anyone named Smith or Miller is actually a blacksmith or a miller. I'm sure somebody will prove me wrong on this during question and answer, but that's an inherited trait in this same kind of a way. So is that the case then? That's what the other camp has argued. The opposite camp has said, yes, bipedal, no question about it, but these curved fingers, curved toes, different limb proportions had functional significance, and Lucy and her kind were tree climbers. This is literally where this debate has been stalled for 35 years, and there just didn't seem to be any sort of a resolution to how Lucy and her forms moved. How do we do these measurements? Well, a lot of this is fairly traditional. We use calipers, as seen with the researcher here, where we can measure things, microscopes to look in fine detail. These are techniques that tell us a lot about size and shape, but they don't necessarily get into the actual function of how something works. And so what we needed to be able to address this question, address the debate about Lucy, was a different approach and a different set of techniques to answer that question. So what we can look at, and the approach that we'll consider here, is some basic bone biology, something we know a lot more about today. I don't want you from this slide to come away thinking that Lucy was a tennis player. But what we do have from this is a very nice example of how bone responds dynamically to the kinds of forces that are experienced during the life of the individual. I can't really see the audience very well with this light in my face, but how many of you out here are tennis players? So there are quite a few tennis players in the audience. So here are some regular plain x-rays of the upper arms. This is the humerus here of a tennis player. This is a male, 23 years old when the x-rays were taken, who started playing at age 9. The left side here has been reversed, so we can more easily compare it with the right. But even at this level, you can see that the bone of the racket arm is much more heavily built than the non-racket arm. There's much more bone there. Why is that? That action of hitting the ball, hitting the ball, hitting the ball has built up the bone within that arm. If we look in detail with the X-ray, you can see that the bone is hollow, but even the shaft, the cortical bone as it's called here, is much thicker. So this is a good example that shows how action, the skeleton responds dynamically to the sorts of forces that are seen in the action of just hitting that ball. This happens during the life of the individual. This tennis player has a strong right arm because of use. He did not inherit these mixes of small and large arms from his parents. This is something that developed during the course of his life. And so this is some of the biology that we can use as an approach to addressing how is it that Lucy moved and what might be a resolution to that debate. So we can use some analogies from just regular life. All of you probably have had drinking straws. These are very thin walled. Sometimes the wall is so thin that if, for example, you're drinking a milkshake and you're exerting pressure to get the milkshake to move through the straw will collapse. The straw is so weak. But when you look at other kinds of things, for example, here's a thicker tube, plastic tube, it's very easy to see that that thicker wall that is here provides much more strength, more resistance to bending. This is exactly how the skeleton works, except our skeleton responds dynamically to the sorts of forces that we apply to it. So trying to apply this approach of basic bone biology to Lucy is something that requires the same these elements from the same individual. Lucky for us, Lucy has a fairly complete, almost totally complete humerus. So this is the upper arm bone on the right. The left is relatively complete, and she has a relatively complete femur. We can only do this sort of a study by looking at the bones from a single individual. So for example, we can't use, if Jay would let me, take his humerus and compare that against my femur. It just wouldn't work. Jay is an ultimate Frisbee player. I lived on the wrong end of a shovel for most of my youth on the farm. We have different builds, different histories, so it has to be from the same individual if we're going to do this kind of a study. This is why Lucy's critically important. She's one of the only fossils and the earliest fossils that allow us to attempt this kind of a study. The way that we do it is not those old style plain X-rays, but we use CTs instead. Some of you in here have probably had a CT, computed tomography. Some of you may have done the tour of the UT CT lab tonight. So this is a routine technique that's used to identify lots of different things in human patients. It's also something that's used for pets, and I think dogs must have been very relieved when CT scanning, earlier it had been called CAT scanning, C-A-T, and it's more recently called CT scanning. I think dogs just sighed a big breath of relief when that happened. So what's good for people, though, in doing CT scanning doesn't work for fossils. Lucy is fully mineralized. As much as we love her and respect Lucy, she is, I'm sorry to say, a rock. She is mineralized as a rock, and medical CTs are at low energy levels so that the patient doesn't end up developing cancers from too much exposure on down the line. For us to be able to look into something like Lucy, this is the end of her, right at her wrist, we needed a high energy, high resolution system. And so right at 20 years ago now, 3 of us here at UT put in the first high resolution, high energy CT lab on planet Earth. It was Bill Carlson, Tim Rowe, and myself. They're both from geology. And as far as I'm concerned, if we were the first on Earth, first in the solar system, first in the galaxy, and probably universe, we don't know, but this permitted us to do all different kinds of science. When we put this in, our dream was to scan Lucy, but we had, in the early days, an open X-ray source which had to live in this 20-ton lead box. When we put this together, we put it in the basement because it's so big, so heavy, if we put it on the first floor, it would have ended up in the basement anyway. So we put it in the basement. And, but because of this, we couldn't ship it out. Most famous fossils don't move. It was just one of these things that, yeah, it's a great dream, but we really were probably going to have to shelf it. Well, be careful of the things you wish for. That's a good watchword for life in general. In 2002, the Ethiopian ministry decided to investigate starting a tour of Lucy and other Ethiopian antiquities in the U.S. I've worked in Ethiopia now for 25 years. When I first heard word of this, I began negotiations with the Ministry of Culture to see if we could bring Lucy here. That, again, these fossils do not leave the home institutions. If I would have just said, hey, can we bring Lucy to Austin, it would have been an immediate no. But Lucy was in the States anyway. When an exhibit opens and closes and then opens and closes, there's a window in there where things can move. And so what I'd propose is that when the exhibit that opened in Houston won the contract for that in 2007. When it closed in 2008, in between the setup from Austin to Seattle, we could move Lucy to Austin, do the scanning, and then she could head off to Seattle and be in Seattle in time for that opening. So, as I mentioned, that this took 6 years to do this negotiation. I was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in August of 2008, right before the Houston exhibit closed, and they said, you've got permission. And so Lucy got to come to Austin. So here she is coming into the CT laboratory where some of you were tonight. She's in these nondescript plastic cases that are sealed, as you can see here. There's also an armed escort for her. Security was high. This is the most famous fossil on the planet, and we were certainly on edge the entire time that she was with us here for scanning. Only Alemu Ademasu here, who's her curator in Ethiopia, was permitted to touch the fossil itself. So he was that one bone removed from President Obama. But it was just due to the contract that when we've subsequently studied Lucy in Addis Ababa, we can handle all of the bones. Every fragment of Lucy was inspected by Ron Harvey here, an independent conservator, before and after scanning, because the spotlight was on us. What would happen if there was damage to this fossil? Turns out there was no damage to Lucy in our lab or on any of the exhibits themselves. So as happy as we were to have Lucy come to campus at UT, I was so happy and so relieved when she left because we hadn't damaged the fossil. So we have a large team that has worked on this. I joke that it takes a village to scan a fossil and study a fossil, and that's really what we have here. Again, I can't see everyone who's here. I know that Wiley Aikens here from RTF is here. Adrian down here is with us tonight. I saw Matt earlier. Mulugeta Faseha, who'd done his PhD here with me in geology, is in Ethiopia. I know that. So we have a large team. And up in the center here is myself here and Larry Todd. And Larry and I sometimes, we've worked together for a long time, sometimes, if you can even believe this, colleagues mistake us for our two friends in the middle and sometimes call us by their names. I can't even believe that, but anyway, you'll see some more about Larry a little bit later on. So what does the CT tell us? Well, this is a natural break in Lucy's femur, her thigh bone. And this shows you, around here, the thick bone on the outside is the cortical bone. The spongy bone in here is called trabecula. And the thick, dark fill in here is minerals that were deposited during fossilization. So this is not bone, but this is the bone coming around. We can validate the CT scan by looking at how close does the CT duplicate what we see in the actual fossil at this sort of a natural break. So here's the CT scan. And what you can see from this is that fidelity is excellent. So when we went through and did these scans, looked at the cortical distributions, again, think about that analogy with the drinking straw, the wall thickness, we had very good confidence in what we were seeing on the CT scans would tell us about the strength and bending properties of Lucy's bones. Here's some other science. So when people see graphs, they often freak out. The brain turns off sometimes, the vision clouds over, but this is actually pretty easy to understand. So first we have a human here, a human humerus. So this is the upper arm bone. In our sample, you see all these little bitty dots through here. These are all individuals. So when you add up the numbers of humans and chimps in our modern comparative sample, it's almost 2,000 individuals. That's a lot of bones to measure and quantify in order to measure and evaluate one fossil. Chimpanzee and human humeri are about the same size, depends on which individuals you pick, but close enough, and I just scaled these to exactly the same length. Along the horizontal axis here, the x-axis is the size of the bone, but this is logged. Along the vertical axis is how strong is the bone. When we measure the strength on cortical distribution, it's actually an engineering analysis that tells us that. So what we're looking at here are these different strengths. If we say, for example, let's pick a value of size for a human and a chimpanzee that sort of goes through the middle of the clouds of these points, who's stronger? Well, to figure that out, we just run over to the y-axis that you see here, and again over to the y-axis for the chimp. And what that tells us is that the chimpanzee humerus is much stronger than the human humerus. So let's do Lucy. Here are measurements of her femur. Here is her humerus up through here. You can see that with the broken left side, we can still get a couple of scans off through that. What we see, these are the little slices pulled out. We pull them out at multiple places. On the chimp and human, I only showed one slice. It's fairly thick, fairly strongly built. So let's pull Lucy into the mix here. What do we see from this? Well, if we wanted to do that same example, put somebody through the middle of the cloud of points and let's see, where would she fall out? Would she be more human-like or would she be more chimpanzee-like? The problem is Lucy is diminutive in size. As I told you, her humerus is only about 3/4 the length of a chimpanzee or human humerus. So what we have to do is move that point of evaluation over to her size, move our samples down, and then we can do an estimate of where she would fit. So how many think the black circle? Say I. How many think the red circle? The reds are right. So let's read this graph. What's it tell us? Here's the body size. Well, what we see overall is that nobody for humans or chimps is as small as Lucy, but we don't have anybody living up here. We don't have anybody down here. So if we had small humans, the prediction's pretty good that they'd be down in here. Chimpanzees would be down over in this area. What do we find about strength? Low, medium, and high. Lucy is built in relative terms with a stronger upper torso, upper arm than chimpanzees even for her size. Remember, she's diminutive. She's a tiny adult person. So what did we discover? Whoops. I think I hit the wrong thing here. Let me pull it back. All right, so back to where we were. Thanks for your patience on that. So with our conclusions then, if you remember back to what I talked to you about with regard to the internal structure of her bones, again, coming back to the beginning here, yes, when Lucy was on the ground, she walked bipedally. Everybody agrees on that. We agree with that. But what the CT scans show is that she had very strong arms. And you've seen from those graphs, stronger even for someone her size than a chimpanzee, which is a very adept climber. So what we conclude from the CT portion of this study is that she spent a considerable amount of time climbing in the trees. Why would she do that? Well, again, think about somebody who's this tall, tiny little person, diminutive person. Why go to the trees? It's a safe place to hang out at night to get away from predators, and it's also a place that you can forage for fruit. When we look at her scans then, again with the big buildup of cortical bone here, that she spent so much time climbing in the trees that the evidence for this behavior is preserved in the internal structure of her bones. These bones don't look like this because her parent was a climber, like the one-handed tennis player or something like that. It's her bones responded dynamically through the course of her life. So this is a different approach with a new technology that answers a long-standing question, over 35 years for Lucy. So this is where the new science, new approaches can actually provide us some new information. Now the second part with this is the public likes this stuff, and I have a lot of fun with what I do, but you know that you've really hit it when your science ends up on Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. This paper published a couple of days before, it came out on a Wednesday. Sunday morning, I didn't stay up late enough to watch Saturday Night Live. Sunday morning, I had an early email from one of my colleagues, "Hey, Cap, Lucy was on SNL." I'm like, "What?" And she was. And so, I had to watch the clip on this, and it was I don't know what it was, 60, 90 seconds, something like that. And it ended with that girl Cray. On the one hand, that's not exactly what he said, right? People know what would have gone in there for girl. But, great that we made Saturday Night Live, but it also, I felt a little deflated. I had no idea what that meant. So I had to ask my 17-year-old son to figure out what that actually meant. So coming back then to her bones, that before we did all of those slice extractions, that we had to look at the bones, that they're actually pulled out at fixed percentages of length. And one of the things about Lucy's upper arm bones, these are the humeri then, the right side, left side, two different views of them, is that the head at the shoulder on the right side is really broken up. We've known this ever since Lucy came out of the ground. It's a really dramatic set of breaks along this portion. The left side here looks pretty good, but it actually has some very minor breaks as well in it. What do these look like up close? Here are all of the fragments, so this is a slightly different view on down here, and I've traced them out in red so that you can see where all of these little fragments are. The head has been crushed down into the shaft, and there are lots and lots of little fragments in here. So this brings us to the part of the talk where we pull in CSI, and that's the question about how is it that bones break. We have a pretty good idea about how bones break, and many of you in this audience have probably had broken bones as well. We can divide them into 3 different groupings: antemortem, postmortem, and perimortem. Antemortem breaks are the kinds of breaks that we suffer during life before death. This is a lower leg bone of a bison that lived about 2 million years ago. And this big callus that you see around here is the bone's attempt to heal itself. There was no bison orthopedist there to reset these bones. Here's what they look like on X-ray, and you can see how the bones just went past each other with that break. The animal lived long enough, though, for the bones to naturally heal, and that's what developed that big callus. So healed fractures are common. Many of you have them. Luckily, we can generally get to a physician to have those bones reset so that they heal up nice without that big callus on them. Postmortem breakage, these are breakages that occur after death. So if you saw Professor Almotar's jig out in the hallway where he was breaking bones, those were dry bones, those are all postmortem kinds of breaks. These are often transverse to the length of the bone. If it's dry, the fragments disperse apart. This is a deer scapula, shoulder blade, and you can see how the force has just broken the bone apart. The third class of breaks are called perimortem. This is at or near the time of death. This is a CT scan of the face of an unfortunate individual who took a 40-meter fall off of a bridge, landed face down on his chest, and you can see that the entire cranium is fractured out. Now, the reason that all of these little fracture pieces here, the teeth, didn't fly apart is because, and I'm sparing you this, the victim still had flesh, muscle on top of these bones. So that kept everything in place there. So what we see for perimortem is that we see lots of different little fragments, and generally they remain at that point of injury. So let's look at that Lucy humerus again. So this is looking down on the bone, and what we see are up to 30 little fragments through here. Some of these fragments are the size, literally, of a fingernail clipping, a millimeter in size. So we'll zoom up on this one with a high-resolution photograph showing this. It's tiny in size, and there it is. That little piece of bone that's even thinner than a millimeter has stayed on the humeral head of Lucy for 3.2 million years. It's one of the smallest fragments out of the many fragments on the head of her humerus. Now, I'd mentioned before Larry Todd, he was the one posing with me with our donkey friends, that one of the things that Larry works on in the Americas are bison jumps. These are kill sites where Native Americans would run bison herds over cliffs, and so there can be really large accumulations of bones at these sites. This is one of the bone beds that he works on. Between Larry and me, we've worked on broken bones across our career for more than 80 years. We know how bones break. Larry's also an archaeologist, so one of the things that archaeologists study is how people break bones as well. When we looked at these breaks in Lucy, he and I both had eyebrows coming up. It was literally like we were seeing them for the first time. We had never seen anything like this in the tens of thousands of other bones and fossils that we had looked at. Now, one of the nice things about science is you can test this stuff. And so Larry drives a Toyota Tundra, and this is a deer humerus here, and so he used his 1 ton of force and drove over the top of this head, and what happens? Breaks apart. That's what most fractures do. And the nice thing about science is you can replicate studies. I drive an F-150. So here are some of the bones that I've driven across, and the same thing. These are dried out deer bones from New Mexico at a rest stop. You can just go back and forth, drive over these things, and they break in the same way. So we have a pretty good idea about what postmortem breakage patterns look like. Again, coming back into Lucy and looking at this humeral head, you can see that the curvature is retained here. If something broke that at a flat edge, we would expect that curvature to be destroyed. So in retaining the curvature, what it looks like is a force, a compressive force, came down on the head of the humerus and drove it down into the shaft. And this looks to us like it's a compressive perimortem fracture. Compressive, driven into itself, perimortem. The fragments are still there. I've shown you that little sliver of bone that's on that portion of the head. So this is a point where then we turn to the clinical literature. How is it that we see these breaks? It didn't take very much time at all with some of the surgical journals to see that the break that we saw in Lucy's humerus here was a textbook example of a 4-part proximal humerus fracture. This happens during a fall. You know, it's not the fall that gets you, it's the impact at the end that does. The fancy term for this is a vertical deceleration event. What happens is that the person falls, as we've all done. We reach out our arms instinctively, the hand hits the ground, the body continues through, the shoulder blade impacts the head of the humerus. If it's violent enough, high energy enough, it drives itself down into that shaft, breaking up the humeral head and the other components around. So here's what these breaks look like as they progress. Broken up, driven down into the shaft there. What's interesting with this particular injury is it's a unique signature of that injury. That if I'm standing up here and when the projectors went out, if I had just lost consciousness because I was so freaked out by it and I'd fallen to the ground, my arm would have been at the side, the muscles limp. You know, I might have broken something, but I wouldn't have produced a 4-part proximal humerus fracture. If I trip over one of the open holes up here and fall, reach my arms out, there's a chance I will. These fractures are divided between 2 different populations. One, older people, seniors, who have lost bone mass have just a thin shell of a humerus. A lot of the trabecular bone, the spongy bone, has also been eroded away inside, where a fall from standing height under the arms can cause a 4-part humeral fracture. Why? Because the shaft is like one of those thin drinking straws. The second population are young people with healthy bone who suffer a high energy impact. I've shown you the CT scans of the cortical bone distribution in Lucy. She was uber strong in her bone distribution, that it would have taken a very high energy fall to produce that sort of an injury in Lucy. So here are some CT scans. This is Lucy on the side here with the different fragments color-coded out. These are all tiny little fragments in here. The colors just mean they're from a region, a particular region of the humerus. She has a little bit of a shoulder blade preserved here. So here's that curvature that I mentioned to you that matches the curvature of the head. And here is a modern human fall victim where it shows the same fracturing of the head of the humerus. The scapula here is oriented differently because radiologists have a heart. When somebody has this break and the person comes in from a CT scan, they don't make them raise their arm overhead to take the scan. They get to keep the arm at the side of the body. So after looking at the literature then, it's important to corroborate this with experts. And so we brought in Dr. Stephen Pierce. Some of you here in Austin may have had him as your orthopedic surgeon. Orthopedists are used to looking at people our size. And so Lucy, as I'd mentioned to you, is diminutive in size. This is a 3D printout. You may have seen it out at the science fair of this portion of the shoulder that I've been telling you about. Her humeral head is the size of my thumb. Now, we could have shown this to Dr. Pierce, and he's experienced enough, he probably could have easily identified this, but, you know, if McDonald's can supersize, by golly, we can supersize. So we printed Lucy out at human adult scale, and I went in, he was kind enough to see me. I just said, hey, you know, I've got a bone I want to show you. Didn't know anything about it, didn't know where it was from, how old it was, what it was. I handed this to him, and he said, oh, that's a 4-part proximal humerus fracture. Do you have a question for me? I mean, it was just absolutely no question at all about what this was. Well, if you get one expert, it's always good to have more. One of my old friends, actually from elementary school, Tom Helpenstell, is an orthopedist in Seattle. This practice sees more high-energy impacts and injuries than we do in Austin. A lot of skiers, climbers, and so on there. It was, again, a cold look. All he knew, his brother actually gave this to him, just said, it's an old bone, Cap wants you to look at this. And they came back with Tom and his other 6 associates, and they said 4-part proximal humerus fracture. If it's a young individual, it had to be high energy, period. Now, What's interesting with these fractures today is that high energy means automobile accidents. Most of these injuries that walk through an emergency room are from a car accident. So think about this. As I thought about it many times while my son was doing driver's training and I was in the passenger seat, the brake gets hit, my arms come out, and if it's an accident, it's going to collapse my shoulders into one another. There were not cars, we're certain of this, in Lucy's time. And so we have to think about what else might have generated this sort of a high energy fracture that would collapse the humeral head compressively down into the shaft. So here are some of the reconstructions. This is a tremendous amount of work, actually. When we do the CT scans, we can go in to the digital data and digitally dissect out the little pieces. So Matt Colbert, I don't know, Matt, are you in here? Maybe not. Dissected these out for us, and then Wiley from RTF came through and did these reconstructions where we put the broken pieces back up to where they were in life. So the front row here rotates the broken humerus around the vertical axis so you can see what that looks like, and it also includes the area down at the elbow. And then the other portion is a reconstruction of Lucy where we brought all of those 30 pieces back up to where they actually were in life. So this is what she looked like, the before in life and the after at post-injury. What's fun with this sort of work as well is that you can make animations with this, and this is where Wiley is the expert. That the program that we use, that he uses to do this, is called Maya. It's the same animation program that Pixar uses, and I've said many times before, if Maya is good enough for Pixar, it's good enough for my lab. So this is what we have. And what we can do with this then is do a movie of this. So what we're going to show, this is the reconstructed humerus, what it looked like in her life, and we will break it, just like what's happening outside. So it's rotating around, not that she did, but just so you can see the different anatomies, colorizes to the different components of the head, and then you'll see the scapula making contact and compressively expanding all of this stuff out as it goes around. And there's also a break that occurs at mid-shaft right down here, a spiral fracture that also is associated with this break at the head. And there it goes through with the breakage. So not only can we use CT to analyze the break, we can reconstruct the break as well. So that's the story on the humerus. Her left humerus also has a fracture in it, but it's the initiation of a four-part humeral fracture. It's a sort of a fracture that's there. When I showed that to Dr. Pierce, I said, what would you do with Lucy in this case? He said, well, on that right shoulder, it is so badly damaged that we would just do an open reduction, take all of the pieces out and give her an artificial joint. Maybe we'll do that reconstruction next. On the left side, you know, it's going to hurt her, but she'll probably be okay with that. There'll be a little bit of limitation in movement, but she'll probably be all right. So in looking through the skeleton then, we found other fractures as well. I'm just going to show you one additional one. This is Lucy's knee. So this is Don Johansson, who found Lucy. This is a photograph here from '76, shortly after she was found. And we're going to look in detail at the knee here. What's interesting about Lucy, when we look through the skeleton, is that there's been very little reconstructive work done to the skeleton. Pieces that were broken were glued back together. In fact, we can see the glue lines on the original fossil when we CT scan them. The glue is something that we can see on the CT scans. But when we look at her knee, the knee is the only portion of her skeleton where the scientists actually went in and took all of these pieces apart. Rather than just putting things that were separated together, they took them apart and put them back together to reconstruct the knee. And you can see in doing that, some pieces in here were missing. They're actually, I think, underplated inside the shaft here. Well, one of the things that paleontologists do is make molds so that we can make casts. If you were out in the hallway looking at some of the materials from my lab group, you saw lots of crania of fossil humans. Those are all replica casts. So molding and casting is something that's routinely done. And lucky for us, they had molded Lucy's knee and, in fact, the entire skeleton before they took it apart. So this is what her knee looked like here on the front. If you're looking right where your kneecap is, the patella, we don't have that on there. And this is looking at the back of it. And what you see here, again, are lots and lots of little fractures. In fact, what we see down here, these are called the condyles, is that it broke along the shaft here and it drove the condyles up into the shaft. So it's again a compressive fracture where the bottom part broke loose and it pushed it up into the shaft to the point where the groove that your kneecap slides through, you don't even see it. It's underneath this shaft. That represents, again, a high energy impact. Where do we see them today? Car accidents. Why? The knee's out as you're driving, it hits the dash, whack, pretty bad, or in falls. So Wiley has finished an animation for you. I'm just showing you a few screen grabs here that show this. So this is what Lucy looks like today because this area has been reconstructed. But we've taken the cast apart, digitally dissected that cast because that gives us the outside surface anatomy. And it shows how these bones then were impacted into one another. So this is, again, a very severe impact at the knee. And here's an X-ray of a modern human patient from a fall that shows that you can get this same kind of compressive impact fracturing at this point. So in going through Lucy's skeleton, what I've talked about tonight are fractures at the shoulder, especially the right, but as I mentioned, there's a fracture at the left shoulder as well. We've talked about the fracture at her left knee, but even though there's no femur on the thigh bone on the right side, there's a fracture at her right knee as well. There's a fracture at the ankle. We've looked through lots of these different kinds of fractures. They all appear to represent high energy impact sorts of fractures. We think they're perimortem. Why? Because these tiny little bone fragments are remaining in place at the site of injury. And as I'd mentioned, this is a unique signature of injury. This is not what we see in the bone beds that we've worked at. It's not what we typically see in our fossils. So how do perimortem fractures happen? Well, there are several different ways. One of the oddest ways is by a lightning strike, for example, where the electricity, that voltage, can set the muscles into contracting so violently that it breaks the bone apart. Epileptic seizures, if they're severe enough, can also break bone. What's the break look like? Bones coming apart, not being driven into one another. Blunt force trauma in floods is something that happens routinely as well. But if you think about it, with this unique signature of injury, the arms coming out, you can imagine perhaps somebody trying to brace themselves. But we've looked at average velocities of floods, and they don't generate the sorts of high energies with impacts, even with some of the fastest floodwaters that we've seen in the literature, that we think that these could be responsible for the fractures that we see in Lucy's skeleton. Injuries and fractures caused by animals can happen as well. There is no way that this encounter is going to turn out well in Yellowstone, but bison are known to actually hit somebody with their horns, throw the person up in the air. They'll go up maybe 3 meters. Sometimes they'll break an arm and a leg, but a 3-meter fall does not appear to generate high enough energy to produce the sorts of fractures that we see in Lucy's skeleton. So what we're looking at here, again, because she's a bone-healthy individual, healthier than any of us in this room, is that it probably would have required a high-energy vertical deceleration event. Again, no cars at that time. And all of the cases that I've shown you for modern victims from X-rays or CTs are fall patients. They're not automobile accident patients. So what's interesting, and I think one of the things that really captures people's attention with this, again, comes back to this unique signature of injury, that we've all tripped, we've all fallen. When we do, the arms come out. What that tells us, if we're right on this, that they are perimortem, that we've identified this unique signature, is that Lucy was conscious at the time that she hit. We all know, because we've fallen, what was going through her mind in what was probably the last moments of her life. And that's remarkable. I can't say that there's any other fossil I've ever studied where I have any idea of what their last conscious thought was. In this case with Lucy, if we're correct in this and it was a fall, arms out, we all know what that's like because we've all done it. We can identify with another individual across more than 3 million years of geologic time. That, to me, is a remarkable feeling. And I still remember when I had that, it was just this moment of empathy that rolled over me where I could imagine for the first time this fossil that I'd studied, actually casts anyway, since I was a graduate student, so for 30 years. But at that moment, I could see her broken body laying, bleeding out at the foot of a tree, and I knew her death. And in understanding her death, I better understood her life. So what else about Lucy with where she was discovered? What does this tell us about trying to solve this mystery of her death? Well, here's the area in the Hadar where she was found. She was found in a small, thin sandstone bed. Within that bed were crocodile and turtle eggshells, along with rodent skulls and some crab claws. So it was a very thin bed. We don't think it was a high-energy deposit. If it had been high energy with cobbles, rocks, boulders, yeah, it might have been blunt trauma from a flood. But there's nothing about the nature of that deposit that suggests it was high energy or that there were large objects in transport that could have crushed her. It's located on a low relief area of the distal floodplain. The river was almost where it was out, emptying into a lake. So there was very low relief across that area. And the stream bank itself, this little stream, probably wasn't a high enough bank if she'd fallen down over it into the channel to cause these sorts of high energy fractures. So this is the modern Awash River, which is very close to Hadar. And I'm wondering if any of you can give me any idea about what sorts of indications in here that might be something to think about. What could produce the high energy? The trees. We have lots of trees. Why do trees live on rivers? It's where the water is. It's either above surface or below surface. So we see lots of trees in these areas. And that's what we're looking at. That's the hypothesis that we put forward here. And again, remember, her shoulders, her arms, that structure suggests she was a climber, a very good climber. Heavily built bones, climbing so much that the evidence preserved in the internal architecture of her bones. Why? To avoid predators and also to probably nest up there to get out of the predators and to forage. We've gone through the literature and looked, how high is it that chimpanzees nest? We've looked at these measurements. There are lots of them, thousands upon thousands of nest heights. Doesn't matter whether a chimpanzee lives in a forest or whether they live in a wooded savanna. They appear to get up to around 14 meters or so. There are some very extreme heights. Sometimes they nest on the ground, but the average height is 13 to 14 meters. So a fall from that height, you can do the calculations of the physics on this, or the physics of a fall, free fall from that, is at a velocity of 60 kilometers per hour as you're hitting the ground. So when you're driving home tonight, and you're in a 35 mile an hour zone, that's 37 miles an hour at 60, you're driving home, just imagine, if you will, keep your eyes open though, that the car that's surrounding you, the metal plastic, vaporizes, it disappears, and it's just your body going forward 35 miles an hour, and all of a sudden, you hit a wall. That's what we predict this might have been. So we have a little animation for you here on this, where she's falling out of the tree. I've turned the sound off, so you don't have her death throes and wails at the end. There she comes down. And if ESPN can do slow-mo, so can we. So these are the breaks that we're predicting for Lucy at these different points of impact. This is one where, we may or may not be right on this. Some people said, well, why didn't she hit her arms first? That's a very severe injury. It's possible, but if she had hit arms first, she would have had to flip around somehow to then land on the legs. And the break on her right ankle is called a Pylon Fracture, and it's a fracture that occurs when, in this case, the head of her talus, the little ankle bone, is broken, when the foot is dorsiflexed up. So that means that we think that foot was forward like this, where the body was actually pitching forward. The other part of this is that when we, let's see if I can come back, whoops. I wonder if we're on the wrong one here. I don't want to watch this again, it's too scary. The rest of my presentation disappeared here. Oh, that got stuck in by mistake. Here we go. We've got lots of monsters here tonight. So, as I'd mentioned, that we see a more severe fracture in her right shoulder than left, and what that tells us is that there was a higher energy impact on the right. We think the body came down in this way on the right, and the fracture in her pelvis also appears to go from right to left. So we think the body actually twisted then as it came down, and we see other fractures that are consistent with this kind of an impact. So the point that you should really leave with tonight is that it appears, if we're correct on this, that we've identified this unique signature of the injury that tells us that she was conscious in the last moments of her life when she reached those arms out. Now, these kinds of breaks don't end up killing a person generally, the breaks themselves, but what happens when that body impacts is that everything else inside the body also has a deceleration event. The heart can rip loose from its arteries and veins. Kidneys can rip loose. We think with this sort of severe damage that we see in the skeleton that there were massive internal injuries, and we think that death probably followed swiftly on this impact. One of the ways that we can evaluate this hypothesis, and this is with cooperation with the Ethiopian government, is to release these 3D files. So some of you have seen these files outside in the hallway. What this means is that anyone, anywhere on planet Earth can go into our website down here, elucy.org, download these files. You can look at them on your computer, or you can print them out. We have the bones both in their reconstructed states here, in the injury state itself, and you can look at these on your own to see what these breakages look like. And what's fun with this, with all of the digital advances that we've seen, is that it's now possible to share these sorts of digital data, the actual evidence for human evolution. It's not the sort of thing that has to be locked up in museums anymore, under glass, limited number of specimens. Anyone, anywhere on the planet can now look at the history of our species through time. And it's just fun that here's our little diminutive Lucy leading this effort from this Ethiopian record for fossil humans. So, at the beginning, we didn't have a question mark on this, but as I've mentioned, that science is something that builds on itself. So the question mark is here, did we solve this 3.2 million-year-old mystery or not? Well, first part of the question, did human ancestors divide their time between the ground and in the trees? We've presented our data. We did something that no one else had ever done before. When Lucy was first discovered, CT scanning, at that time called CAT scanning, dogs forgive me, was something just invented. What was it? It was medical. What the X-ray, what they look like? Nothing. You couldn't see inside Lucy because they were low energy. So our work with a new technology has suggested that yes, she spent time both on the ground and in the trees. Did she die from these injuries sustained from a fall when she hit the ground? We think that the breakage patterns that we've seen, the subset are perimortem, at the time of death. The original description of Lucy in 1982 concluded that every break in every bone was post-mortem. So if I've succeeded at anything tonight, I hope it's been that bone fractures are not all created equal, that you can break bones in lots of different kinds of ways. We think that we've identified these as perimortem, but I look forward to the rest of you, especially the folks who are here from the high schools, looking at this in the future and seeing what else you can see for it. Now, one of the things with this project overall is that we were really fortunate that the Ethiopian government trusted us with one of their national treasures, bringing that here to Austin to do some science with it that no one else had ever done. We received a very gracious gift from them, and it's always good to give things back. This is one of my field crews in northwestern Ethiopia. One of the things that we do is we train lots of students, both Ethiopian students and American students. So this is a fairly large group here. We had a little table out in the hallway as well, so it's a Middle Stone Age research experience for undergrads. If any of you are high school seniors, you can apply to this program. It provides fieldwork opportunities in Ethiopia along with research opportunities in labs here in the U.S. So as much as we're given, it's always good to give things back as well. Now, last year, I was fortunate to have both my son and daughter join me in Ethiopia. So here's my daughter Abby on this side, my son Jack on this side. You wouldn't recognize him today because he actually put on 6 inches of vertical height since then. And myself here, we're standing with one of our good friends, Zachariah, who owns this farmland and lets us excavate. You can tell that the three of us are related to each other because one, we have on dorky field clothes. Two, we have these big floppy hats, and we all three wear glasses. So, but it was great to have them out in the field where they could actually see what we do on these sorts of projects. Jack was very much taken with the young kids there, that he was literally the magnet. Part of it was he was a young person. They'd never seen a young American out here before. The kids gravitated to him. I don't know, maybe you know, it has something to do with the fact that his pockets here in his field vest were stuffed full of his old Matchbox cars that he gave to kids. But he was really taken by these kids and looking at the way that they lived and what their lifestyle was like in this area. And that comes down to education here. This is the local school that's near our camp. Larry here, again, we brought them a map of Africa so they could see where they live. This is their schoolhouse back behind. You see sunlight coming through there because it is literally a stick hut. This looks like a chalkboard, but it's not. It's actually a piece of galvanized tin roofing that they've painted white and painted their lettering on top of this. This is what these kids have for their educational materials. When my son saw this, and he didn't say anything to me about this, but we got back to the States, and he said, you know what, we're going to do something about this, and I want to provide school supplies for Ethiopian kids. And so he started a charity with his friends here who are down in front, and with Piper, Ruth, and Jacob, called One Mind at a Time, student-to-student learning through giving. And it's a non-profit where 100% of any donations go directly to providing school supplies for these kids. So on that point, I'm really proud of him for doing that. And this team is working really hard to generate these monies. So I'd like to say Amasaganau to you tonight. I don't know if Lucy spoke Amharic, but she certainly spoke whatever it was that they spoke in Ethiopia at that point. Thank you for your patience. And as we get to question and answer, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. So we'll, if you could be quiet, we're going to start the Q&A. If you must leave, please do so as quietly as possible without disrupting us. Thank you. So, John, we'll take the first question from Slido. And remember, you go to slido.com and you can ask questions that way. And the first question actually comes from Cynthia Whitney. What sparked your curiosity about how Lucy died?
Well, Cynthia, you know, it's interesting that when we look at most fossils, we have no idea how they died. That the evidence is rarely preserved in the bones. What do we have for our ancient fossil record? It's bones. That we rarely get any ancient soft tissue. Most of us will die from something that affects soft tissue. That there's not a lot of traumatic deaths. And honestly, when we started our study of Lucy, it was literally to learn how she lived, to do the study of the bone anatomy. We had no idea that we would ever come up with any indication about how she might have died. Again, remember, this fossil's been studied for over 40 years. Everybody who's anybody in my field has looked at this. I've looked at it for 30 years, and it wasn't until December of 2015 that this actually popped in to my eye, where I could see this as something different than we'd seen before.
Great, thanks. This next one comes from Katie Klein. Katie, are you here? Katie asks, what is the most common misconception about Lucy?
I think, Katie, the most common misconception is what I talked about at the beginning of tonight, that she was solely bipedal. Now, when I showed you those data on the CT scans of her arms, and we also looked at her legs, there's nothing a priori that says she would have come out looking like a chimp. You know, if she'd come out looking like a human, we would have said, yep, she's fully terrestrial, there's no indication of climbing here. We didn't know ahead of time which way she was going to come out, one way or the other. She came out looking like a chimp, and in some ways she looks like a super chimp. So I think one of the misconceptions we have is with that focus I'd mentioned earlier on about thinking about brains, about tools, about bipedalism, because we're thinking about us, the habitual biped, we didn't provide enough room within considering our ancestors to do something different than us. We've always been thinking about how they become us rather than being themselves.
Very good. This one comes from Anonymous. Do other scientists agree with your conclusion?
The really good, smart ones do. And we've had, honestly, I joke, if all we had said from this study was that Lucy died of something, somebody would have disagreed with it. But it's interesting to look at it. It's almost a bimodal distribution about people who agree with the results or think they're plausible and those who don't. The team that discovered Lucy are adamantly opposed to her being anything other than a habitual biped to a person. They do not accept these results. They've come up with other ideas. Oh, she was killed in a flood. Well, we think that's not the case. She was trampled by an animal. These are not trampling breaks. So the other side of that, though, are any number of other researchers who agree that it is plausible. There are those indications, remember, curved fingers, curved toes, different limb proportions, shoulder joints, that for years, 3 decades, have suggested arboreality. Many people more strongly agreed with this arboreal component in Australopithecus before we ever published. For them, our results simply add to what they had already accepted as a conclusion. So this is a debate that is going to continue for a while. We've got posters, presentations on this next week in Vancouver, and then I'm giving a paper in April in New Orleans where I'm certain our critics will be there. I joke with my students it's going to be like swimming with sharks with no cage, so we'll see how that goes.
Okay, this question comes from Robbie Cole. Robbie, are you here? Yes, no? How did it feel? Thank you. Robbie? Where are you? Thank you, Robbie. This is such a good question. You're going to get one of the door prizes. How did it feel the first time you saw Lucy in person?
Well, the first time, Robbie, was in Houston when the exhibit opened. So today Lucy is under lock and key in the vault in the National Museum. Before I'd done the CT studies, it wasn't anything that I studied. That I'd seen casts of Lucy, but the exhibit, I don't know, did any of you here see the exhibit in Houston? Some people did, or it also went to Seattle, New York. It was in a glass case about this high. You could literally come up, you couldn't touch the case, but you could get your face right down close to it. And it was remarkable to see this fossil, that she is one of the most iconic fossils we have. Her layout against that black tabletop background is recognizable by people all over the world. She's arguably the most famous fossil on the planet. So I don't know that she'll ever go on exhibit again. What we have available to us in museums are really good high-resolution casts. So if you want to actually study Lucy, you're probably going to have to become a paleoanthropologist and go to Addis Ababa to do that.
Nice. And here's a question. Anne-Marie Melendez, are you here? Yes. Anne-Marie asked this question. Another good one. Another door prize winner. Could you tell if Lucy had children based on her pelvis?
Well, we've actually looked at that. So what happens during childbirth is that the pubic symphysis becomes loose. So it's connected with a ligament. So it's not a bone-to-bone suture in the way that the bones in your skull are sutured. And those ligaments loosen at childbirth. It's not exact, but as women have larger numbers of children, the surface of that symphysis becomes more smooth. So women who have had several children, 3, 4, 5 children, oftentimes we can look at that pubic symphysis and see that it's smooth. Remember, Lucy was a young adult female. We think that Australopithecines matured faster than we do. So if you found someone today, a modern human with M3s, the wisdom tooth erupted, we'd say, oh, they're between 18 to 22 years old. Chimpanzees erupt that tooth around age 12. So we think that Lucy probably was only maybe 13, 14 years old or so. But once chimpanzees hit skeletal maturity, dental maturity, they're usually cycling to the point where they can become pregnant. In looking at Lucy's pubic symphysis, it has a rough surface to it. Maybe, maybe not. But because most young female chimpanzees do birth fairly early on, the odds, I would say, are better than average that she had a child. But unfortunately, pubic symphysis wouldn't tell us that because she's so young.
Excellent. Well, and another award-winning question comes from Kitty Coley. Why was she preserved and not eaten by animals?
Another good question. Many of our fossils, when we look at them in detail, again with the microscopes, looking really close with them, we actually do see carnivore chew marks on the bones. Or later in time, we see that humans have butchered an animal with cut marks. They can either be from a knife or a stone tool. When we look at Lucy's skeleton, And we have looked at her skeleton in more detail than anybody else. We've gone over every single centimeter of every single bone fragment. Not only are there no chew marks on her skeleton, the bones also didn't weather very much. We think she was buried very rapidly after death. And if that fall did occur out of a tree, we think it was probably in proximity to a stream channel, so that she was almost probably instantaneously buried. In Africa today, just like Texas today, that once a carcass is out on the ground, there are lots of animals around that see that as food. You may not know this, but vultures in Texas can actually deflesh a human corpse in less than a day. And that's also the case in Africa. So if Lucy had stayed on the ground surface for any period of time, we think that the bones, many bones, would have been broken up, lost, and that we'd see that sort of damage on the bone. As I mentioned, we see no damage at all. We see one puncture mark in her pubic bone that's been raised as a possibility of a carnivore chew mark, but there's only one mark. I don't know any carnivores who only have one tooth, so we think it's probably just a puncture mark when she hit the ground.
Excellent. Well, this will be the last question, and it's another award-winning question, and after that we'll raffle off the rest of the prizes. This comes from Claire. Are you here, Claire? If you could ask Lucy one question, assuming she could answer, what would you ask her?
Who pushed you off the tree branch?
Let's thank Dr. Kappelman once again.